Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Fighting Matters. This time we have a very special guest. It's a journalist who's written what I think is a really important piece in the Washington Post called 2 Nights in Vegas with the Fan Bros of the UFC. A lot of us in this, if you're listening to this, you probably consume a lot of fight sports content, either video content, you watch fights, you watch jiu-jitsu, you watch one championship. But this is a piece that I think anybody who's a fight fan or is not a fight fan needs to read in order to understand sort of our political moment in America. I'm really glad to have you here today, Albert. Thanks for coming.
Thanks so much for having me. Glad to be here.
How did the idea for the piece come about?
As a sports writer, I feel like there's always two roads to a lot of story generation. It's like the path of like escapism and just finding a really interesting story that really doesn't have anything to do with anything happening in the rest of the world, which is kind of why we love sports, right? Is to kind of enter this fantasy realm where nothing else matters other than kind of these artificial stakes we create. And that's one thing I love about being a sports writer, is that method of escape. But then sometimes the world takes on these turns where nothing else feels important, and a lot of these pursuits of escape can sometimes feel not necessarily trivial, but they don't quite carry the same power, at least for me. And I know after the election, like a lot of people, it was kind of this question of, okay, like what comes next for our country? What comes next for our world? And in me specifically, what comes next for my work? A lot of the stories that I had sort of had on my list had nothing to do with the things that everybody was talking about. And I feel like my duty as a journalist, as somebody with a platform, is to try to help people understand the world better, help bring them joy. If not joy, then at least some understanding. And I had been taken by how tightly intertwined Trump had become with UFC. It's something people had written about. People saw that he came after his criminal conviction. He came after the election. Everyone was familiar with Joe Rogan's role, with Dana White's role in supporting him. And so I was sort of just looking into that ecosystem, asking myself the question of like, is there anything else I can add? Are there any questions that I'm curious about? And I realized that I didn't have many questions because I was largely unfamiliar with the ecosystem. I've never been to a UFC fight. I'm a huge sports fan, but not a huge UFC fan. I'm at most a casual UFC fan, maybe not even that. And I realized that I was sort of professionally thinking about this area, this space, this subculture that had become so prominent in our mainstream discourse about America, and yet I knew so little about it. So before I even had an idea of like what I wanted to write about or what the story might be or what questions to even ask, I just knew I had to go. I just had to go and I had to talk to people. And a lot of the times in my job as a journalist, not just as a sports writer, but generally, when I find myself at a loss for what to write about, it's often because I feel detached. And, I'm getting older. I'm not hanging out with the same 20-somethings I used to be when I was 20-something. And as a journalist, I think it's always important to just like, if you don't know what to write about, if you don't know what's happening in the world, just find a place that seems important, get on the ground and start talking to people.
That's fascinating. I have a million questions for you, and I promise I'm not going to take up all the air in the room. But one of the guys you describe in your piece, Joaquin, 19-year-old kid, he's from Oregon. I really identified with this kid as someone that grew up in Oregon myself with a working class background. And what you said before about sports, I think the role of sports in our lives is fascinating, partially because it can be this beautiful escape. And I want to get into like the guys you hung out with and their points of view as well. But first, I want to talk about journalism for one question, then I'll see if Steve and Stephan have some questions. Like high up in the piece, you quote other mainstream media outlets, the New York Times and Rolling Stone, as saying effectively, you can't understand Trump's America if you don't understand the UFC. Do you think the mainstream media takes fight sports seriously enough as a cultural force?
I do, generally speaking, particularly UFC. But I think, and when I quoted those institutions, it was almost like an effort to use first person without using first person, because I read and subscribe to the New York Times and UFC, and those headlines reflected my own understanding as well. Right, I am a part of the media, and I think folks in the media take fight sports generally seriously as UFC as an institution with a $1.5 billion contract with ESPN, with a leader who speaks at the Republican National Convention. I think it's no longer an issue of whether or not folks take it seriously. I think it's now the question is that next step of understanding what it is we're taking seriously. Because I think generally for a lot of people who aren't fight fans, UFC is relatively new to their life. And perhaps they had some preconceived notions about whether the barbarity of it or the kind of these very like surface level understandings, maybe not even surface level, but kind of the things you see when you're standing far away. I think people were aware of that. I certainly was. But I think like anything, when there's kind of this new institution that's suddenly having a bigger and bigger role in people's lives, it's easy to just sort of focus on the ways in which it reflects the things we already know, our preconceived notions, especially when there's sort of an alignment between, I think, the values of the people who maybe aren't big fight fans, and they're sort of seeing a, a president that they perhaps do not align with become a really big UFC fan, right? So if you already weren't a UFC fan, if you already thought it was like way too violent, and if you already weren't like a supporter of Trump, and then you see Trump go into UFC, for someone on the outside who's liberal or center or just not into MAGA, not into UFC, you see those two worlds clashing, and it sort of it affirms the things that you would already assumed about the sport. And I know that to at least some degree that was the case for me. So I'm kind of not just speaking generalized, but from my own experience. And that I think in journalism is always a place to like start from is your own biases. And knowing that you probably share biases from a lot of people. And so if you're examining your own biases, that in itself is a public service of trying to understand how a lot of people are gazing at something. So to me, it wasn't a matter of not taking UFC or fight seriously. It was just a matter of understanding it more.
That makes perfect sense. If I could follow up on that, one of the things about politics that comes across is these guys are not what I would call political. They are not people that adhere to rigid ideologies. They are not people, in many cases, who vote, but they are people that enjoy the spectacle that is the UFC. They enjoy the art that is the martial art. They enjoy the pageantry. You cite Alex Pereira, which of course is I would love to hear your experience with his walkout. There's what I would call a cynicism there, and I'm not sure whether to call it a cynicism or an apolitical nature, but it sort of seems like there's a they're all the same. And one of the things that that I personally think about the UFC is cynicism and apolitical behavior allows fascism and strong leaders to come in and fill the gap. And I'm wondering if that's a thing you observed.
Yeah, I think it's very easy to sort of project the perspectives of like Rogan, White, Trump, Andrew Tate onto like the entire mass of fans. And if there's one thing you learn as a sports fan growing up, it's how different other fans of your own team can be, right? Like I don't want to, like I think there's an overwrought cliche of like sports bringing people together that people take too far. But there is this idea that like when I was in college, one of my closest friends, was a Republican and I was a Democrat. And in college it was like this cool thing of like, oh, but we're both into sports, so we're both gonna like be friends, right? It's very simple. A lot of people have those kind of experiences, and I think a lot of sports fans intuitively understand that that's the case. But I think what's happened with UFC more than any other sport that I could recall in recent memory is that the loudest voices representing that sport have all sort of aligned on a single political sort of concentration that that has come to just represent everybody else. But I guess it was hard for I was like I know UFC fans, I know like big UFC fans that like that don't align with Trump. And I guess from just that anecdotal small sample size understanding, I was wondering how often that actually is the case. And that's was sort of the driving force for the reporting and the motivation for it was that like I know massive UFC fans that go to UFC fights who are not the same people that are being represented in kind of this generalized brush. And that sort of tension was the fuel for kind of digging in deeper.
Sure, but if we had to generalize, or if we had to quantify rather, what percentage of people attending a UFC voted Republican, voted Democrat, and did not vote, I'm going to argue that it would be a very significant majority in categories 1 and 3, which is voted Republican or did not vote, and a very small percentage would have voted Democrat in this U.S. two-party system. Do you think that that is correct? Like,
I can only
allowing variation of individuals, of course, but if we're looking at this statistically.
I could only speak of the very small sample size of people that I spoke with, but from like the couple dozen folks that I spoke with, that generally aligns. Though I think the thing that in itself might not have been too surprising. I think what I found surprising was that even the people who did vote Republican, a lot of them were not like loyal to the party, did not feel particularly strongly about that vote. And that's surprising to me because I covered the first Trump administration when I was a national reporter at BuzzFeed. And I just, I think I've sort of developed the assumption that a lot of people who support Trump are very, very, very strong in their loyalty and their allegiance to him. And I guess what I found with a lot of these UFC fans is that there were things that they said they liked about him, but they did not see him as like this transformative leader that was going to make their lives better, which I think was different than many other Trump supporters I've spoken to at campaign rallies, for example, in other reporting I've done, that largely they were generally apolitical, that even those that voted were sort of apolitical, which I think and I think one of the sort of core messages I wanted to get across in the story is that like these are folks that are open to ideas, that like they might have voted in a way that I or others disagree with on this particular election. But I do think that one thing that I was trying to understand is like where are these where's their headspace, these young men? Have they sort of planted their flag on like a ideological or political side and said, this is what I'm fighting for? Or are they just sort of navigating this landscape that they don't totally understand and are trying to find people that they trust to guide them in the right direction? And it was more so that was the thing that I think, regardless of whether they voted or not, who they voted for, that they had in common, at least a couple dozen folks that I spoke to.
Yeah, I think personally that most UFC fans fall into the third category, and that there are two words that I want to bring up here, one of which is in your piece a lot, which is authenticity. These guys seem to be looking for, they're like, I would consider voting for anybody as long as I authentically think this is an authentic person that has my best interests at heart. And I think that says a lot about the disaffectedness that young people are feeling. And I think that people of all ideological stripes, including apolitical, are craving, somebody that really has their best interests at heart. And the other thing I wanted to mention, I don't have a question here so much as an observation that I'd love your reaction to. I've thought about sports my whole life, and one of the things that I think attracts us to it, in addition to the escapism piece, is, in my mind, simplicity is not a negative word. Because at the end of the day, I have no idea whether I'm a good husband or not. I have no idea whether I'm a moral actor in the universe. I have no idea whether the jiu-jitsu classes I've taught for the last 100 days have been more effective. Am I teaching the best I can? These are the complex things that exist in our world that are the big questions that are super challenging. But if the Mariners score more runs than the Oakland Athletics, the Mariners win, and we all go home happy. And I think that applies to all sports, really, but fight sports in particular, where there's such a dynamic outcome in a lot of cases, a flashy knockout, a highlight reel submission.
Yeah, I mean that's such a profound way to put it, that there is like a clarity there, a clarity with is that ice cream truck? Should I wait for that to pass?
Mm-hmm.
Is that cool?
No, leave the ice cream truck in. I think that's going to make a lot of people hungry, and maybe we can get some ad dollars.
There you go. I think sports kind of marries the within this realm of escapism, right? The clarity of like winners and losers, good guys and bad guys, with the sort of these artificial stakes. And I hate to call them artificial because emotions are real. And also a lot of people put money on sports, which is like real stakes. But basically, like, our stakes in sports are entirely like self-induced. Like, we choose to be emotionally invested. We choose to gamble on it. But outside of that, it's like, and so that's all within our control. And I think in a like chaotic world, there's just something comforting about that control, that that we can enjoy the thrill of euphoria at the risk of despair, but only because we've sort of consented to the terms of that engagement with sports, and that there are clear answers that we could debate, and just kind of this world that we can understand, that where nothing really matters, but we can still have an outlet for our emotions without having to actually engage with those emotions, which, is something that I myself have struggled with. It's that, I'll be someone who's like, won't be emotional for a long time, and then, the Warriors will lose and I'll be like on the verge of tears. And, my friends who are more emotionally intelligent than me are probably wondering, like, where was that when we had this conversation about this serious subject, and obviously there's like a whole realm of discussion about masculinity that we can get into with that. But yeah, I think that idea that sports has this clarity to it is comforting.
Can I just expand on something here? This is Steve from BJJ Mental Models, by the way, for those who are listening on audio. Albert, thanks a lot for writing the piece. I really enjoyed it. And something that you just talked about, which I have definitely observed myself, is this desire for certainty and simple, clear, easy answers, which seems to be so emblematic of things like fight sports. Someone wins, someone loses. It's very clear. It's very simple. There are easy answers. And something that I've observed with talking to people in the MMA and jiu-jitsu spaces is that they tend to gravitate towards those simple, easy answers. When I speak to people who are, Trump supporters or who would identify as MAGA, a big characteristic that I see a lot is they've got a very definitive worldview of how they believe things are. And it's very hard to shake them out of that. Whereas I personally, I would try to take a more nuanced kind of view of how things work. But for them, often there's good guys, there's bad guys. This is how it is. Is that something that just I'm observing, or is this something that you noticed when you were talking to the people involved in this piece as well? Do you think that's something that maybe is emblematic of the fight sports community?
I think so. I mean, I think it's emblematic of broader than the fight sports community. I think fight sports taps into it in a way that is maybe a bit more like extreme, because it's, the fighters are often caricatures of themselves and really larger than life personalities, and the like wins and losses is the same as like getting beaten to a bloody pulp versus, beating somebody in a match, so it's sort of these extreme versions of it. But I do think that people generally, the more like chaotic and crazy the world is, I think the more the allure of simple answers will be. Like, I think a lot of people, I mean, I think that's one thing that Trump tapped into, is that he really simplified the argument down to like regardless of like the reality of them, like saying like, this policy will do that, this will do that, she's bad, I'm good. And I think, I mean, look, I'm not a political analyst, but I think one of the critiques that I've had of Kamala Harris's campaign was the way that it sort of pitted fascism against democracy, which, like, on its face seems like, oh, that's a great message. Or, of course, who wouldn't choose democracy over fascism? But then when I would like talk to more people about it and think more about it, it's like, well, these are just words. These are just hollow words. And for people who are just like living their life and not like deep in like political philosophy, whatever the system has been, even if it has been democracy, hasn't been working for them. So to like pin your campaign on this idea, this word that represents what America has been to this point, but if what America has been to this point is not working for a lot of people, it doesn't matter how great democracy sounds in a dictionary. It's not. It's there's not really a simple argument there of what you're getting. It ends up being like a complex campaign argument wrapped in a seemingly simple one. So I think what you're pointing out with UFC fans and kind of the allure of that, I think it's broader there. And I think UFC is sort of a microcosm. I think all sports is a microcosm for the allure of the simplified good guys, bad guys that appeals. Because even if you talk to people that aren't into sports, the elements of sports that draw them in are the narratives, the characters, the dramas, and I think that's something that has universal appeal.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And something that I enjoyed about your piece is that you really focused on the human stories of people who live in the fight sports ecosystem, the people who are super fans. Many of the pieces that I've read that attempt to dissect the UFC to MAGA pipeline, which I think is absolutely a real thing. I mean, I think you could very effectively argue at this point that the UFC is mostly a propaganda arm of MAGA. But the people who write about that, they tend to kind of take this high level view of how all of these pieces fit together, whereas they don't really talk about why people would get digested into the system and why they would buy into it. And the thing I liked about your piece was it was kind of agnostic in terms of taking a political stand, but more it was telling the story of just regular young men who are into the UFC and what that looks like to them. And I think that's something that we lose a lot these days when we try to do political or media analysis, which is to focus on the human side of the story. It's easy to just jump into judgment about how can you support these people. But I really appreciate you doing a piece that that spoke to the story behind people, because I think that helps people. I think that helps us better understand why people would make UFC and MAGA such a huge part of their identity.
Thank you. And yeah, that was the goal, was to really get to that granular human level. I found that that's oftentimes the easiest way to cut through a lot of the headwinds of like political debate, is just like getting down to like who people are and why they believe what they believe. And to some of these fans, like they've been UFC fans longer than it's been like explicitly political, So they weren't drawn into this through their politics at all. It just sort of landed on them, and now they have to deal with it. Now they have to be in a room. I talked to one of the fans I talked to. He's black, and he associates MAGA with a lot of like white supremacist ideology. And he was saying how he'll walk into a UFC event, see the MAGA hats, and it'll activate some fears, but he will never actually feel the fear, because it still feels like this, that within the realm of UFC, everyone's sort of putting their stuff aside. And that's sort of why a lot of the folks I talked to were irritated by all the MAGA gear that they see at UFC fights, because they're like, look, don't care what you believe, but this is supposed to be a space where we put all that aside, and to quote things that Trump supporters said before, like shut up and dribble type of thing, and sort of, it's an ironic twist on the way Trump and his allies would criticize Colin Kaepernick and other NFL players who were kneeling for like bringing politics into like what otherwise is the safe space sport.
But that's completely impossible when you've got the President of the United States and half of his cabinet sitting ringside, Dana White at the RNC, Dana White in the Oval Office, Dana White talking about how Trump is the toughest guy that he knows. Like, at that point, getting upset at some dude for wearing his MAGA hat at a press conference or at the fights is a little bit ridiculous, because I guess I've been watching the UFC since the very beginning and following MMA since before there was a UFC. And to say that it was apolitical, I mean, the only sense in which it was political is that the government at the time was always in danger of banning it. And then in about, in the early 2000s, Trump had an event in Atlanta. Dana White had an event in Atlantic City at Trump's casino. And then the ties really started, come 2015, 2016. It's everywhere you look, there's yet another connection. But there really was a time, boys and girls, when this wasn't political and it was kind of an outsider thing. By definition, it was like the thing that all of the politicians wanted to kill.
It's a really good point, because now it is like you said, it is unavoidably political. They have the politicians have made it, the highest level of politicians have made it political. And for fans like you, for a lot of folks that were in it before, that like I can only imagine how disorienting that might feel, where this sort of recreation, this pastime that once represented. And the thing is, the UFC still sort of, at least nominally, tips their cap to this idea of fighting being like a universal sport that sort of undermines the reality of how like Dana White has like handled the politics, because like before the fights, they'll have these promos of saying like, it's an ancient sport, everyone fights, fighting unites all cultures, and like a lot of this like propaganda. But the reality is that like when you're bringing the cabinet of the president when you're welcoming him into the front row, when you're having video tributes on the screen when the president comes in, like that's unprecedented. Like heads of states have attended sporting events before, but I'm not sure if I've seen a case where a league will have a video tribute for that head of state as they're entering. So you're absolutely right. Like the politics is completely intertwined now in a way that it's hard to see how to untangle it now that it's got to this point.
Speaking of someone
and to go to your point about it being them paying nominal tribute to it being an ancient sport, which culture are they usually referring it to? Are they referring it to some peaceful tribe in, I don't know, imaginary Polynesia? Oh no, it does tend to be late Republican and early imperial Rome, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the gladiators. By definition, imperial Rome was not a democracy anymore. I'll shut up now.
No, you're good. I mean, as someone who came up training with Royce Gracie, watching the transformation of the UFC into what it is now is really interesting. And I wanted to return to the problem of messaging, because we talked about how I think a lot of what Trump tapped into were simple answers, right? You blame this person, I do this, and everything is fixed. This is something that I don't even think is a left and right issue. It's broken down as a left and right issue and why the left struggles with messaging. But I think it's also a moderates versus radicals issue. And one of the things that really freaks me out is how moderate Republicans have been not just left, but been violently expelled from the party. And I think why that is boils down to simple answers versus complex answers. Remember who the politician was that was crusading to get the UFC banned. It was John McCain, a moderate Republican who called it human cockfighting. And I have other thoughts about like why we can't just let people have their fun in this country, but we can save those for another day. The thing is, if most people I think that are critical thinkers on all sides of the political aisle would acknowledge there is complexity in everything, and there's certainly complexity in fighting. But one of the things that I noticed too, not to say that striking isn't complex, I don't think it's a coincidence that these folks hate jujitsu, which is much more complex and much less obvious, because everyone understands why a knockout is awesome, right? You don't have to explain to your buddy that's never seen the UFC why Justin Gaethje getting knocked out by Max Holloway was awesome. Royce fighting Dan Severn is it's still a fascinating thing that I teach my students about, and it's super boring for people that don't know what's going on. So I would say to my journalism and messaging students that there are two reasons to say a thing, because every utterance has a truth value and a practical value. And radicals don't care as much about the truth value. They just care if it's useful. And then you have people that are moderate Republicans, your John McCain's, your Jack Kemp's, your Adam Kinzinger's, who are like, wait, okay, I'm generally on your team, but you have lost a big portion of this audience.
And I think that ties to the point you made earlier about like the appeal of authenticity, is that it's people just sort of shooting from the hip, and that a lot of these like UFC fighters, they speak from their heart, and they're, after you've just gone through, 5 rounds of like bloody battle, being performative doesn't probably register. You're just going to like say whatever it is like you're really feeling. And that seems, and maybe that's, I don't know if maybe that's a different idea than the idea of simple versus complex. But I think there is something about authenticity that even if the idea you're communicating might seem complex, people will like ride with you, and maybe they will listen to you when you say that simple thing but complex thing, because they trust that what you're saying isn't trying to manipulate them. It's not trying to get over on them. And we live in a world, in a country where you're always worried about, you're getting scam texts every day, you're getting phishing emails, like we're just in a disinformation, like we're in a era of mistrust all around us. So to find these people that you do trust and whose judgment you do trust, I think is so valuable, and we hold on to them, and those are the people with the real power.
And this is where I want to get back into talking about masculinity and Andrew Tate, which you brought up earlier and which you brought up in the piece, because I cannot for the life of me understand the Andrew Tate phenomenon, because there is no more full of shit man on God's green earth than Andrew Tate. And so there are figures like this that even if I don't like them and I find their opinions abhorrent, I get it. Like I get, oh, but you are so on, like Jorge Masvidal is a great example. Right? Is Jorge an example of toxic masculinity? Yes. Are you going to get exactly who Jorge Masvidal is on any given day? You absolutely are. And even I will admit the two-piece with the soda incident was awesome. And I'm not proud of that, but I love it. So what's up with Andrew Tate? I don't have a really complex or profound question there, but what do you think? Did you gain any insights from this?
I think the thing I was most curious about was like what it was that was resonating. Like, was it the entire message? Was it a particular thing he said? Was it just that he was shoved down people's throats, like, on social media? And I mean, most of the people I spoke to were not fans of his, right? I really only talked to like one guy who I quoted in the story who considered himself like a supporter. He wasn't like a huge fanboy, but he thought positively about Andrew Tate. And I thought it was interesting that he condemned the sexism and the misogyny without like condemning all of him and then saying, but I do like that he motivates us to like persevere and work hard and be tough. Which I mean, it makes me. There's two thoughts I guess that came to mind when I reflected on that discussion. One was that what does it say that like being a misogynist is not disqualifying? Um, is and but then the other part of that coin is, does that mean that there is opportunity to reach young men like Joaquin with who can tap into the parts that are resonating, but from like a non-problematic perspective, right? Because if it's not the sexism and the misogyny, at least that he says, then that means that someone who is not sexist, not misogynistic, but has a message focused on how men can find discipline or whatever, like, can that resonate? Can that like nudge out, like fill the space that people like Andrew Tate currently fill? That's like the optimistic part of me, but the other part of me is like, or maybe like no one will admit that they're misogynistic, but deep down, that's part of the appeal. I don't know.
Let me expand on that, Steve, here again. Because this is something that I've observed a lot that I just can't get my head around. I mean, it's one thing for the UFC to very publicly throw their support in for Donald Trump and to basically turn their company into a propaganda arm. That to me seems odd, but it's a decision they made. They can make that decision, right? There are other decisions that I see with the UFC that I really have a hard time squaring away. One of them, for example, is the support of Andrew Tate. I mean, there's footage of, this guy came to the States after allegedly, running what exactly did he do? It was real bad, right? In Romania. I mean, so, when you get accused of sex trafficking, to forgive that is quite a stretch. But yet not only has the UFC taken him in, they quite literally took him in with open arms. I mean, hugging him, handshaking him, giving him the VIP treatment at the UFC. I don't understand what the UFC gets out of this. As a business owner myself, I can't imagine just randomly picking some accused sex predator and just publicly supporting them for really no apparent reason. And this is not a one-off in the UFC. I mean, the other recent example is Bryce Mitchell, right? A very public Nazi apologist. They are more than happy to platform this guy. And when confronted about it, I mean, Dana's answer is this is free speech. So a few things on that. As an actual journalist, I would love to get your opinion on why you think this is happening, why the UFC is taking these increasingly radical stances with increasingly terrible people. And also, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this free speech argument, because that seems to be the thing that both in jiu-jitsu and MMA is constantly being used as an excuse for why we should platform these awful people. Like, well, they have free speech rights, so we have to give them these opportunities. I, of course, have strong opinions on that, but I'd love to hear from you.
Well, on the first point, I think it's because Dana White hasn't faced any consequences for it, right? Like, look what happened to the NFL when it became very political, and when head injuries became a concern. There were ratings going down. There were parents not letting their kids play football. That's what led the NFL to like either blackball Colin Kaepernick on one hand and change the rules to make concussions less of a concern on the other hand. They were responding to the bottom line getting hit. And then Dana White hasn't experienced that yet, whether it's because enough people who are fans support it, or enough people who are fans don't boycott. Like I don't know, but he hasn't felt the hit, and he has more unilateral control than any other sports commissioner who has to appease 30 team owners. And until the bottom line gets hit, I guess he can kind of do whatever he wants. Is I guess how I take that. And on the free speech point, he sort of flipped on this, right? Because I know it wasn't that many years ago that he was actually quite progressive in terms of like suspending and calling out folks who said like homophobic things and like in speeches and press conferences. And I think he said in an interview like a decade ago that like you can't just, he had the whole like you can't say fire in a crowded theater argument, like he sort of, so I don't know, it seems to me that his position is sort of shifting as it's convenient with like the political climate. I'd be curious to hear you guys' perspective on it. I feel like you guys have more understanding on how that sort of shifted with UFC.
There was definitely a time when they were trying to make it onto mainstream media channels and streaming and cable, when they cracked down and that this is a sport. This is like, who's our poster boy? Rich Franklin. The guy is a school teacher. And that's when they were cracking down on people cursing and swearing. And then I guess, they discovered how incredibly lucrative it is to come and have Conor McGregor attacking buses full of fighters and talking about, it's our podcast, I can say the word, screwing the wife of a fighter who just broke his ankle in the actual octagon. Like it actually started becoming lucrative. But there was a time when I think it was associated with trying to get onto cable and trying to make deals with the various providers where they were trying to clean up their act. So maybe that was pretend, and this is now just way more lucrative to have massive raving fans, and as opposed to trying to appeal to everybody, which is never going to happen.
Well, that's a good point. It makes me think too about the Bryce Mitchell, right? The quote at the end of the first section where Joaquim says, a lot of people didn't like what he said about the Nazis. People don't like him. Everyone's booing him. Everyone wants someone to beat his butt, which will make for great television. So I almost wonder if like there's a way in which having heinous characters who say and do and believe problematic things, if there is some sort of appeal there, because it's different than watching someone you don't like shoot a basketball. It's another thing to see someone you don't like get into a ring and like get their face bashed in. And I wonder if that's what Dana White thinks might be. I don't know. Maybe it's too deep.
You're on a chat here with two, not me, but both Jeff and Steve are massive pro wrestling fans, and this is all. There's a point, or there's an interpretation of which this is all kayfabe.
This is exactly what I wanted to transition to, Stephan, because me and Steve have been watching wrestling since we were kids. And a couple of points about what you said. First of all, in terms of the authentic masculinity as a positive, this is why I'm mad they turned John Cena heel. Because Cena, man, like he could have been that guy, and maybe he can still. But one of the things that's interesting to me, and I agree, by the way, with Stephan about, I think they follow the money. And I think they thought having a wholesome Rich Franklin as the face of the company was probably better for business. One thing we also, like, the analog I come up with to Bryce Mitchell was when they blackballed Miguel Torres for a tweet that could have been, if you squint at it hard enough, a sexual assault joke, and never got a job again. And this was one of the legends of the sport. And now you have people that every UFC event, people say worse, it seems. One thing that I was fascinated by, and in no small measure proud of, is Dana White getting booed out of the building at WrestleMania. And I'm not prepared to make any grandiose claims about the progressive nature of wrestling fans versus the progressive nature of UFC fans. I do think it's rich ground for an academic study to find out who falls into which of those three categories Stephan identified. But what's interesting to me is I do think the UFC has adopted the pro wrestling model, except for it's real. Like Bryce Mitchell really does believe those things. And, and Jorge Masvidal really believes those things. And Conor McGregor really did attack real people in a bus and beat up an old man in a bar. And Andrew Tate really did get charged with sexual trafficking. And so this is where, like, my quick take on it, and I'd love to hear reactions from y'all, is that this gets back to the question of authenticity, where if you can be cynical and say, well, everybody's full of it anyway. Well, that's all fake. Conor didn't really attack that bus, and it makes it maybe more palatable. Whereas wrestling fans who sort of accepted the simulacra are able to like sort of identify, no, this guy's a real bad guy, and we were booing him out.
Yeah, I think a big part of it is that, talking back to the wrestling model, right? I first noticed this back in, I guess it would be the 2000s. That's when I was kind of more actively watching the UFC. I haven't watched it in a long time. But back when GSP was one of their main stars, I remember they were very clearly trying to position Josh Koscheck as like the heel in that fight. And you could tell that this was something that the UFC was new at. They hadn't really yet figured out kind of the nuance of the babyface and heel dynamic and how to exploit that like pro wrestling does. And you saw them kind of experiment with that over the years. I mean, Chael Sonnen is another good example of a guy who very clearly studied the game of pro wrestling to try to use those tactics to draw attention to fights. But at the end of the day, these people were using relatively bog standard pro wrestling tactics, right? Like you come out and you just be an a-hole and you get the audience to boo you, and now they want to see you get beat up by the good guy. But when they really started to go kind of off the bender was when you started to see folks like Conor and I would say John Jones, who were going beyond the line of, hey, I'm saying bad things for the camera to, I am committing crimes. I am actually doing bad things. And that's when people, the willingness of people to accept that was a little bit startling to me. And I think, when you hear Dana White defend this, the answer that he gave just recently to why platform a Nazi, right? Why give Bryce Mitchell, of all people, opportunities? Why pay him money and give him exposure? And his answer was, number one, free speech, which again is not a valid answer, right? Anyone who has a cursory understanding of free speech understands that free speech rights are related to your relationship with the American government. They are not related to whether you need to pay Nazis to expose them, right? It's a very different thing. But the other thing that he said was, well, if you have a problem with that, the great thing about the UFC is you can watch him get his ass kicked. And that was kind of positioned almost like we're bringing justice here. It caters again to this simplified view of the world where we want to see the bad guys get beat up. And a lot of people just swallowed that and said, yeah, let's watch Bryce get beat up. I mean, the reality, though, is that Bryce, win or lose, is profiting quite handsomely from this exposure. He's becoming more famous because of this platform. And Dana White and the UFC are raking it in because they're exploiting, basically their marketing is now to platform Nazis and sex offenders and things like that. And that is pretty wild, but they've managed to, it seems, convince a lot of their audience that like this is actually some sort of weird cowboy justice where no, what we're really doing is we're creating a place where the bad guys can get beat up. And I think again that kind of comes back to this simple answer, this simple world that people want, where the good guys win and the bad guys get beat up, and that's how we settle things. The nuances of things like how a court system works. It seems like a lot of young men don't have time for that, right? They want the simple answer, and nothing is more simple than two people being locked in a cage and fighting. So I wonder if maybe that's a part of it. It really feels like that is another argument that Dana and the UFC have used to justify what I think most people will consider to be just an absolutely disgusting promotional tactic.
Well, to jump on your free speech point, I propose a test. Let somebody who just won a fight speak out about the genocide going on in Gaza and see if they ever get a fight again. Let's see if that passes the free speech test. I'm going to bet you $1,000 that person will never fight again.
Oh, I have a better example. I mean, there's a chance Dana might allow that because he may feel he doesn't have skin in the game. I want to see a UFC fighter win a fight, get the mic, and give a speech about how all of the fighters should unionize. Let's see how that goes. Let's see if free speech still applies at that point, right? And so, I mean, you see the same thing with Elon Musk's use of Twitter, right, or X as he wants to call it now. The standard of free speech is very different when applied to himself versus when applied to people he doesn't like. And I think Dana is a perfect example of that. I mean, we recently interviewed Nate Quarry on the podcast, who talked about some of the free speech infractions that UFC fighters have experienced firsthand under Dana White's regime, and it just isn't a clean standard. So I worry about this too because you talked in your article, Albert, about the young men who kind of live in this space, and it's a real cultural influence for them. And I think for a lot of people, this allows things like platforming these kinds of people to become very normalized, which to me seems really dangerous, to get to the point where now we live in a world where it's okay to hire, just publicly unapologetic Nazi supporters, or to hire violent criminals. I mean, that seems to me to be a bridge too far. But that also seems to be the direction the UFC is going in. And I worry about the impact that will have further on young men in society as they grow up in a world now where this kind of stuff is considered okay.
And it feels like the sort of competition of the attention economy really just propels this stuff forward, where it's almost like the bar keeps getting raised for things having to be more and more and more extreme. And now it's not enough to just have a fighter who you don't like because, he robbed the bank. Now it's like, no, we got to have a fighter who supports Nazis and pit him against, a fighter who's, in this like indigenous tribal gear. I know that wasn't the fight, but this idea that the competition for eyeballs of everyone, but particularly young men, incentivizes the UFC to put more and more extreme things. Because if you look at the other content that like young men consume, whether it's on X, whether it's on TikTok around, they're seeing that crazy stuff too. So it's almost like the UFC is moving toward the kind of Wild West content of the internet at large, as opposed to being like a standard setter of saying, and I think maybe that's one of the problems that we're circling, this idea that like, how is the UFC using its power, its responsibility, that it has all this attention? Is it using it to try to nudge these young men towards like more like healthy, holistic, positive lives? Or is it nudging them towards, ideas that can be harmful for people around them?
It's interesting. I don't know if the bank robbery example was a hypothetical, or if you were making reference to Lee Murray, a former UFC fighter who literally robbed a bank and is still in prison in Morocco over it. What's interesting to me is the pattern seems like kind of a bell curve. In 1993, when the UFC started, I just drew a bell curve. That was dorky. If you're listening on audio, I'm drawing a bell curve with my finger, like the dork that I am. But the UFC was essentially an outlaw sport in 1993. They couldn't find almost any place that would host it because there were essentially no rules. Eventually they had it in Denver. And a lot of these dudes that were fighting were rough and tumble dudes. Joe Son, who did what Andrew Tate did. Argue, I'm not going to say better or worse, but like both did heinous crimes for which one was imprisoned, one should be. Then you had people doing that, like, I think of Tank Abbott making fun of a dude when he's stiff as a board. And you had people that were committing literal crimes. And then in the middle, I'm not going to try and use the term go straight. I guess I am. But when they would try to go to mainstream, when the Fertittas bought it and they decided, okay, we want this to have mass appeal, suddenly there was an effort to clean up. And it feels like we're kind of back at the beginning. Like if you imagine a Holocaust denier at UFC 3, you could be like, okay, that's awful, but that tracks. But now, as a multi-billion-dollar industry endorsed by the President of the United States, it feels markedly darker.
It does. I think that's a reflection, though, of kind of the world around us feels markedly darker, right? And I think when the UFC was first competing for airtime and space, it was within this sort of gate-kept pasture of like cable TV, where it's like you have to go through these particular institutions if you want to like make money, if you want to reach eyeballs. Where it's now, I think, because the UFC is not just competing with, boxing or NFL, it's competing with everything, right? It's competing with all the screens that are taking up attention and all the things that are like reaching for our attention. And like, I just think of like what my Twitter or my X feed looks like now compared to what it like 3 years ago, where it's like, I don't know how it is for you guys, but like now I just see on my For You page a bunch of like people getting hit by cars and like street fights and just a bunch of like men being involved in like horrible like group activities. And and all I follow on like this is like my burner X account where I just follow like sports and basketball people. But it's like, I didn't ask for any of this, but it's just coming at me. And it's holding my attention because I'm like, oh, two men outside of a bar swinging at each other. I'm not going to look away. Let me, watch all 45 seconds. And I wonder if like what UFC is tapping into is a desensitized generation of young people that have grown up with this and are grown up used to seeing all these extreme things. Maybe in 1993, a jiu-jitsu master and a kickboxer clashing in an octagon was extreme, but now you could find things way more crazy than that online, and I wonder if they feel pressure to kind of turn it up a notch, or at least let it flow as like at least not put guardrails to wherever it goes.
I'll say it out loud. The ultimate example of desensitizing people to things like sex crimes is having a president who has been convicted of sex crimes. Letting felons fight in the UFC has been enabled by having a president who's a felon. I don't think Trump is a white supremacist Nazi, but not having disavowed the massive support that he gets from white supremacist Nazi groups. Proud Boys, Stand Down and Stand By. All this shit has normalized. And now, of course, Trump is connected intimately to the UFC. So why are we clutching our pearls and going, oh, here's what Bryce Mitchell said? There's somebody in the front row with this giant fucking montage, an homage to him playing, who has not disavowed Nazis, who is a sex criminal, who is a convicted multi-time felon, who even his supporters agree lies continuously. So I'm sorry, this is your podcast, but I'm going to be the guy who says it, and this will probably get clipped and taken out of context, and I'll get a few more death threats, and what's life without death threats?
Interestingly, so Albert, I spent many years as a journalist, and guys, I don't know if you know this story. And so I worked in rural Washington, and where we have native tribes here that have treaties. A lot of times, in rural areas, and this will segue back to an economic class, which I think will be the last thing we should discuss. But and I was working at the end of the '90s and beginning of the 2000s when gay marriage was first starting to become legal in America. And so this small paper I worked for took a lot of what I would consider very controversial political stands. We printed the first gay wedding announcement in the county we were in. We wrote pro-tribal editorials all the time in a town that was not pro-tribal. And the only death threats I ever got, and these were, and I will tell the tale, and I don't want this to necessarily be death threat hour, but this fascinated me more than it scared me. So there was a high school here in Washington that was called the Port Townsend, and the mascot was the old Washington football team mascot. And I feel some type of way about that. But I wrote what I thought was a really moderate sports column about this, where I didn't say you're terrible for rooting for this team. I didn't say this is always terrible. I took a much more balanced and nuanced perspective than my actual feelings. But at that time, the Portland Oregonian, I think the Cleveland Plain Dealer, had said, hey, we're just not going to use the name. We're going to refer to it as the Washington football team, which I thought was a really sensible compromise. And I wrote that as what I thought was this middle of the road sports editorial. And I got so many death threats. One guy found a picture of me and had drawn and had photocopied it and drawn a little my severed head bleeding, like my head on a pike. And it was signed Port Townsend Redskins fan. And I was like, it's a mascot, man. It's a high school mascot. And I was, and I think this says a lot about the role sport plays in our life emotionally, where all this other stuff is stuff that intimately impacts the local economy, human rights, stuff that I think, the freedom to love who you love, and stuff that I think is really foundational. And the only stuff that got people really mad when I was like, yeah, we won't use your nickname anymore. Isn't that weird? So yeah, thanks for letting me tell that tale. The one thing, and we're almost at an hour, and we want to respect your time, but I wanted to talk, Stephan and Steve, feel free to chime in, but I wanted to talk about the role of economic class in your piece. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting is you have these dudes who are by and large working class dudes who are admiring what you might call the hustle, the hustle set, right? And this is even what Joaquin, one of the things he finds admirable about Andrew Tate is don't let anything stop you. Go forth and essentially become rich. And I do think this is very appealing to young males who feel a lost sense of purpose, maybe. And what's interesting to me is the sort of presupposition that the UFC really did used to be a working class sport. and then it was bought by billionaires. Now billionaires run it, and the billionaire president supports it. And so that disconnect was really interesting to me. Did you have any observations about that while you followed these guys around?
Yeah, I mean, the writer Bell Hooks talks about how patriarchy harms men almost as much as it harms women. And I think there's this idea that like we are socialized as men to measure our self-worth through our ability to like provide and protect. Make money to feed our family and get big and strong and learn how to fight to protect our family. And even as so much has changed in the world, even as expectations for men are changing in the world, that was one thing I was really curious to see for like the next like younger generation, like people in their 20s, to what degree they're engaging with that. And like that is still, I think that a lot of men are like ill-equipped to reckon with like the inability to attain the ability to like provide and protect. Whereas for women were socialized to expect the world to mess them up, to like throw sticks in their spokes, to push against them, to oppress them. And so there's a level of, I think, resilience and perseverance that women have to emerge into adulthood carrying, ready for the world to like come at them. And with a lot of these guys, I think they're navigating these changing expectations of like one, that the way to define masculinity doesn't just have to be about whether we can pay the bills and get buff and protect people, because there is so much more to life than that, right? That is no longer enough. Women can pay their own bills and protect themselves these days. So our jobs also have to be to like provide emotional intelligence and communication and like support and all these other areas of life that were sort of shunted to the wayside in priority for money and strength. So I guess to tie it into like the specifics of the story, I think it's a lot of young men who like have a vision of what they're supposed to grow into, but don't have like direction to get them there, aren't existing in an economy that is providing them the opportunities to attain these things. But these are the things that we're told should be the measure of our self-worth. And so they're sort of stuck between these two like eras, right? The era where it was easier for men to make money because there were no, women were prevented from being in the job market, and perhaps this future era where the economy is much more balanced and provides more opportunity for all people to be upwardly mobile. Instead, they're in this in-between phase where it's harder to make the money and get the jobs. And the economy has not yet adapted to like the changing social dynamics and social expectations. And maybe some of those expectations haven't changed for a lot of people as well. And I guess it's not that I like feel bad for young men. I think that would be patronizing, but I recognize like the challenge of growing up in a world where your father told you about how the world was, but then by the time you reached your father's age, you realized it was an entirely different world. And so you're looking for different people and places, like different people to tell you how are you actually supposed to navigate this, because the tools that we were told as men to navigate the world in many cases don't apply and should not apply. And so where do we find the new tools? That's, I think, the question that I grapple with, and I think a lot of the sources I talk to.
And those expectations are to some extent spread by people like the masculinity grifters, the Andrew Tates. I'll say, Andrew Tate had Hustlers University. So it's to his advantage to be able to argue, you got to be able to make money. How do you make money? Well, I don't care if you don't have high school, you can come and join Hustlers University or Trump University or any number of these other MLM schemes that are promoted by the male, grifterverse.
I think it's pretty telling that a lot of the folks that we would consider to be kind of, male influencer, shady, sketchy grifter types, they all have their own online university. And I wonder if there's something to be learned there from the fact that, they're not calling this online courses, or they're not calling this, my crash program on how to get rich quick. No, it's like, it's as far as they're concerned, as far as they market it, it's a university. And I wonder if that choice of label tells us something, because it seems to be such a common model now, where you get people like Andrew Tate, and they propose this aspirational kind of lifestyle about being a man who's tough, and he's a hustler, and he drives fancy cars, and he's got millions, if not billions of dollars. And then they also run this faux university on the side. I wonder if they're kind of proposing this alternative view of what it looks like to be a successful man, and that allows them then to benefit from all of these young people who, like you said, Albert, they're disenfranchised. Because I mean, as a guy who's in my mid 40s, I've seen this through the lens of multiple generations now, where I remember the world that I grew up in, and the future that was promised to me by adults about, just work hard and XYZ, and here's what you can have. And there's absolutely no question that for the majority of people, especially talking about young men here, they do not have the opportunities that their parents had. And it seems to be getting worse every year. I mean, I'm right on the border of Gen X, millennial, and with every generation that passes, things are getting a little bit more dire for the next generation. So in a lot of ways, it feels like this move to these grifters is kind of almost like a panic move. It's a survival mechanism for people who are looking for something that will give them a future in line with what they had expected. But the problem is, by doing this, they're starting to follow the Pied Piper, I think, in a lot of ways. I don't think these are necessarily the best. I mean, I've never heard of anyone who's actually gotten rich signing up for Jordan Peterson's online university, right? I don't think that that's really a model that works. But yet, all the same, at least they are promising a solution. And to your point earlier, Jeff and Albert, people may perceive that solution as being more authentic and simple and direct, and as an alternative to the things that they've been fed their entire life that haven't worked for them. So I wonder if that's kind of a part of it, because this does seem to be such a common model where it's, we get into the right-wing hustle porn grift, and then we sell you the online university. That's basically a playbook at this point.
Yeah.
Or the meme coin.
Or the meme coin.
I mean, I think you guys nailed it, right? Like it's on the one, on one door, you have someone saying, you too can afford a sports car and your path to fulfillment is as simple as getting rich, and here are the easy 3 steps of investment to get rich. On the other door, it's like, your path to fulfillment is like several years of therapy, having hard conversations with your parents to unpack childhood trauma, developing more platonic women friends so that you could have more enriching conversations, and being more emotionally vulnerable with your male friends. It's like, fuck that. That's way harder. Let me just like sign up for this hustler university and get the sports car. Like, I think the reality is like hard to confront. I know it was for me, like as like someone now in my 30s and trying to like confront who I was in my 20s and unpack the generational traumas that led me down mistakes and harm and all that. Like it's hard work. It's long work. And it is not, there's no like bite-sized appealing message for someone to say like, here are the answers, right? That's not going to fit in like a TikTok. And even if it does, it's not appealing if there's someone else saying, yeah, you could do that, or you could do this. And I think that's the exploitative part of it that Stephan, you alluded to, and the simplified nature of it that Steve, you mentioned, is that like there is this direct parallel there with the way that those messages are reaching young men, with the way that like Trump's message reached a lot of people. Is that like, yeah, we could do all that the hard way, or we could just do this. And especially if you're a young person, who's, your frontal cortex isn't as developed or whatever, you're less impulse control, less long-term planning. It's hard to turn down, I imagine. I know it was for me when I was, that age, and I was hearing those kind of messages. So I empathize, and I'm not sure what the solution is, because it's like, just there need to be more of like the Patty Pimblets type voices, right? Like I sort of wanted to use him as like a ray of hope, that like there are the Andrew Tates, the Dana Whites, the Joe Rogans, the Donald Trumps that are pulling people in like one direction, but like a guy like Patty Pimblett shows that. And look, I don't know his politics, and I don't think my sources know his politics either. They just know that they heard the message, and he was someone they respected because of the way he fights. And this great irony of, because he is good at fighting, young men will listen to him talk about why it is important for men to communicate with more vulnerability. And that to me gives me goosebumps to think about, because it's like, okay, like, young men can be reached. It's less about the message if you have the right messengers. And I think that's the two sides of like optimism, pessimism when we're talking about like UFC's responsibility to like promote, use their platform to have like, you know, whatever the right kind of voices are for young men to hear. But that sort of showed me a path to like, how can this work? What is sort of the resistance against this like this toxic masculine grifter culture? It has to be people like Paddy Pimblett. That those are the kind of people that the young men will be receptive to, because that's just the reality we live in now. Maybe we'll get to a point down the line where young men will be receptive to all sorts of messengers, but like if we're confronting the situation as it stands now, that's the power the UFC has. It has those attention. That's the power fighting in general has, is that it does have the attention of young men for reasons that are very complicated and, you know, worth unpacking, and that I know you guys like think about and study deeply, but that's, to me, that was kind of the message that I was trying to move to in the story, is this idea that it might seem like this is all just a bunch of like, you know, bros screaming their heads off for this bloodthirsty violence, but there's a deeper level there that's about connecting with people and finding trust in people you find authentic. And if those people are promoting the right message, that could really go a long way.
I think that's perfectly said. And I think that's an amazing note to end on, unless anybody has final thoughts for the good of the order.
No, I'm good, Albert. Thanks so much for coming by. I mean, like I said, I think your piece was fascinating. I definitely recommend people who want to understand kind of the state of fight sports, particularly the UFC. I definitely recommend people check that out. Where can people find it, and where can people learn more about you if they're interested in doing so?
Yeah, the story is at the Washington Post. I mean, you could probably just Google UFC Albert Samaha Washington Post. Will probably be the easiest path. Or you can go to my website, albertsamaha.com. That also has all my story archives. I think I've got a gift link for the story there if you're not a Post subscriber. And social media is just, I'm on all of them. It's under my name, easy to find. And yeah, I'm always happy to like chat with folks if any folks have story ideas or want to share their opinions on the story. I'm always happy to hear feedback, because especially from fight fans, man. Because I'm like I said, I'm a casual. I'm sure a lot of our readers are not like devout UFC fans. So anytime I delve into any kind of subculture, I'm most interested in hearing the perspectives of the people that have spent a lot more time there than I have. So I really appreciate speaking with you guys and hearing your perspectives and having this conversation with y'all.
Most definitely, man. I enjoyed it a lot. And if you want to find Albert's piece, you can also follow me on any form of social media, where I've shared it everywhere. I'm at Bellingham BJJ most places. And I also want to thank you for being our first guest, as far as I know, to quote bell hooks.
Hopefully not the last.
No, definitely not the last. And I'm going to talk to you offline about an academic research project that I got the idea of after reading your piece.
Love to hear that.
Thank you so much.
All right, y'all. Thanks, everybody. And yeah, we'll see you next time for an episode of Fighting Matter.